And now I would like to introduce our panelists. Austin Faison, the town manager of Winthrop, Julie Wormser from Mystic Valley Watershed Association, and Leah Robbins from MAPC. Thank you so much for joining us this evening.
So on behalf of everyone who's sitting up here, I just want to thank everyone for coming out. You know, I brought up climate change in my budget presentation in March, and in every decision that I'm making in the town of Winthrop, climate is taken into account. It is literally the thing that is impacting everything that happens in the future of this town. Every neighborhood will be touched by the effects of climate change, and the sustainability of the community depends on us being able to adapt to climate change. I have said it publicly, I could take my entire $65 million budget each year and spend it only on climate change, and it would not be enough. Winthrop has a lot of work to do to prepare ourselves for the changes of how we're going to interact with the ocean. So what I'm going to do right now is go through one of the ways we're trying to account for this. And what we did in June of last year was there was a final report that came out, and it was on our municipal vulnerability assessment. And what I'm going to do is use the metrics that the potential projects that were utilized in that, and show how my office has been trying to attend to these matters and how we're trying to interact with other entities to alleviate some of these issues. So to begin with, I'm the town manager. Here's a picture from, this was March of last year. So, I mean, it's pretty warm, or pretty wet. That was just a flooding event that happens in Winthrop, unfortunately. Here is one of our public safety officials wading through the water during the bomb cyclone. You can see the amount of ice that's there, and the water was knee-high. Here was a nice little tweet video that went out where someone who was kayaking through the streets of our town during the bomb cyclone as well. It's here. This is not like we're talking about a potential future. This is impacting Winthrop now. And every day or season that goes by that we're not making decisions based on these potential impacts is additional time and resources that we will have to put into this in the future. There's factors more money we will have to spend in the future if we don't attend to these items now, and we're not trying to attend to them in the present. Do you want to hop in? Yeah. Okay. So it is happening right now. Last year was a prime example of how sustainable Winthrop is. During the bomb cyclone event, what happened was there was an astronomical high tide at the same time as a nor'easter. So Winthrop had no ability to get rid of the water that was in town. We had nowhere to put it. There was no way to flush it out. The water was higher than what we could actually accommodate. So we are trying to work to alleviate that issue. We need somewhere for the water to go, and we need to plan our infrastructure so there is a way for us to alleviate these events that used to be called once in every 100-year events, and potentially could be once every 10 5-year events, unfortunately. We are in the middle of the ocean, essentially. We are impacted as the feeder island of the Boston Harbor. We are the canary in the coal mine for everything that's going to happen in Boston Harbor, and there are serious concerns from my office and the region to the fact that if Winthrop is majorly impacted by a weather-related event, there are multiple systems that impact the entire region that could be at play when you think about Deer Island and you think about the airport, let alone the potential to cut off Winthrop from the outside world as well. So these are really scary, pertinent things that are potentially happening every time you see a storm coming up the coast it's something to potentially think about. Flooding is a constant in town, unfortunately, and there are multiple projects across town that we are trying to alleviate that. And concrete barriers that we have are physical seawalls may not be the best solution for the future. Those have, in best case scenarios, 30-year shelf lives. Right now, with the wave energy that we're seeing and the height of the water and how it's interacting with it, some of those are getting down to the 20 to 15-year range. So it's not even going to last as long as it previously did, unfortunately. So we need to look for other solutions. So in the vulnerability assessment, there were 6 recommendations to try to improve Winthrop's resiliency. First was the sewer and drainage infrastructure. Second, maintain, replace, and upgrade seawalls. Third, a natural and green infrastructure solutions with low impact development. Fourth, a new public safety building. Fifth, maintain and protect Belle Isle Marsh, Coughlin Park, and beaches as assets to the community for both recreation and resiliency support, which goes into some type of natural barriers. And then lastly, identify funding for projects to increase resilience. So I'm going to use these 6 recommendations to talk about how this assessment has guided what my office has been trying to do since I've been here. So first, the sewer and drainage infrastructure. The Center Business District Infrastructure Project is a over $13 million project. That will be an attempt to take care of all of the water, sewer, and drainage infrastructure within the Center Business District to alleviate the flooding within the Center Business District and some of the roads that offshoot from that. Next, when you kind of move down the line, you have the middle school site redevelopment. Now, that building, I can't say for certain what it's going to be. I don't know. That's still to be determined. But underneath it, there's infrastructure that needs to be fixed. And the reason it needs to be fixed is we need this water to continue to flow in the direction that it needs to go. And if we have failing infrastructure in one part of it, that's where the water will settle, unfortunately. Again, down from that, we have the Ingleside Park Water Storage Project. Now, that has funding from what's called the Environmental Bond Bill. That was a 2018 bill at the state level. The money does need to be bonded, so it's not totally funded yet, but we are at 30% design for the Ingleside Park project, and we have already requested our funding from the state to be able to move forward with this project. What this essentially will do is put a water storage container underneath the park. So there is somewhere for this thousands of gallons of water to go and settle during the astronomical high tides and the large weather events. We need somewhere, like I said before, we need somewhere for that water to go. We can't just push it out into the ocean when the ocean is astronomically high. So this is an attempt for us to alleviate some of the flooding in one location. Next up is seawalls. So the state installed new seawalls on Shore Drive. DCR did a good job. We're still working on some of the signage and the lighting down there to make it even better, but it's a good thing to have. Right now, we have a natural seawall in Coughlin Park that I'm going to circle back on because that is, in my mind, the future of how a town like this can interact with the ocean. Lastly, we're exploring funding sources for the Pico seawall and solutions on Morton Street. We had requested environmental bond bill money for those projects as well, but we know that those are priority areas of town that need some attention, and you just need to go back to the bomb cyclone of last year to see some of the pictures of Morton Street to be very clear of what can happen with events like this. So these are all types of items that we are trying to secure funding for and come up with plans so the community can have a sense of understanding of where we're all going to stand. So then on to natural and green infrastructure. So green infrastructure is different than gray infrastructure, which is what we previously had. So you build a parking lot that's tar, water can't go through it, water just flushes off the side of it. Now you do parking lots that are impervious surfaces, so the water can seep through the surface and interact with the topsoil underneath and actually purify the water as it moves through the stream. This is how dirt roads operate and things like that, but because we have claimed so much of the natural environment, we need to think how we can actually let water flow through the system, how we can deal with some areas of town where there's sulfur in the topsoil, or there's areas of town that where fill was put in. We need ways for the water to flow through and be clean the way that the kind of natural world developed. And that's just one example of green infrastructure. This also looks at things called like tree boxes and different ways for the natural environment to operate the way that it was originally built itself before humans intervened. Earth Economics came to the MAPC last week and kind of the region and presented on green infrastructure projects. So on eartheconomics.org, it's a great website because they have a lot of case studies of where this works. You can look at Greenland, New Hampshire. There's a Target there. You wouldn't even know, looking from the road, that there was green infrastructure installed there, but about 50% of the parking surface was actually pervious surfaces. So the water is going through that. There's no impact to the salting and the plowing during the winter and stuff like that. It just works there, and no one would be the wiser unless we highlight it in things like this. So in the long term, there is less maintenance that you have, and in the short term, the costs are becoming closer and closer with gray infrastructure. So we are getting to a point that green infrastructure is just the better financially responsible choice to make. So we're going to be taking that into account, especially with Ingleside, is going to be a great opportunity to incorporate little elements of green infrastructure, because we don't need to just have asphalt paths going through a park. We can have different ways to interact with the park so that our water doesn't just push every item that's left there to interact with our grass and stuff like that. There's better ways we can do it. And in addition, post Ingleside as well, I want this to be a priority for every project in town. I want green infrastructure taken into consideration, whether it's a private developer or we're doing a project ourselves. I want this to be taken into consideration because it's the better thing to do for our environment, but it's also going to be the financially prudent thing for people to do in the longer term. It is a better bet to make these investments now than it is in gray infrastructure. In terms of the public safety building, we are working with a consultant to site this. Full stop, the biggest issue with it is how we can deal with major storm events. So climate change is impacting where we can even site a public safety building, and it's limiting the choices that we have, because when you have the servers that deal with public safety, the CAD systems that they use with emergency services, which we have those outsourced, but we could always potentially bring those back in from the wreck in the event that we had a modern building that could deal with weather events. This needs to be essentially our best building in town that is most capable of dealing with these events. And unfortunately, as of right now, there are only 2 sites in town that work for that, and they're very expensive sites. So we're still trying to figure out the best site, engineering-wise, where we could put something like this so that during these major events, that building can still operate, because we need that building to operate almost above any other building in town. So climate change is, when I say this, impacting every single decision that we make. We can't even find a place to put our police and fire departments, unfortunately. So we are still working on that, but climate is essentially the #1 item in dealing with this potential siting. So then natural barriers. This picture in the upper right-hand corner is the new natural barrier at Coughlin Park. It's not a seawall. It's not cement. But there is an intention to that. The reason why we are pursuing this, we did it with Coastal Zone Management and the Nature Conservancy. The engineering was done by Woodard and Curran. And the intent of this is, there's going to be waves there. You can't stop the waves from happening. If you have a piece of concrete there, it's just a wave hitting against that concrete. And all of that energy goes into that concrete. This natural seawall, instead, in the curve up where there's the grass on the left side of the picture and underneath some of those broken shells further down, there are essentially logs of coconut fibers in them. And what those do are almost act like a sponge, and the energy dissipates in those materials. So what we're trying to do is almost do a little like judo with the ocean, and instead of just putting up a wall that it's hitting into, we're letting the energy kind of almost be absorbed and pushed back a little bit. This is new for this area, and we're going to be a test case for Quincy, for example, is all physical barriers. That's all their mayor wants there. Their environmental department is coming here to look at this, and they want to interact with Woodard and Curran to see if there is a better way to do this. In Boston, all of their new interaction with the water is parks, their natural berms, this type of work to take on the, not just when the waves come in, but if it does flood, where does the water go then? There's Moakley Park in Boston that's being designed. There's actually an amphitheater built into it that during the summer when it's nice out, you have a concert in there, but during these events, when water comes up, it's a place for the water to go into and stay until the water can be drained out. So this is the potential path forward. And what's nice about this is it doesn't go away in 30 years. If this material grows there and we leave it relatively undisturbed, this is a model that can last significantly longer than that potential 30-year shelf life. So I know it's different. I know what happened during the Bond cyclone last year, where the water came up essentially around the seawall that's right behind this picture and ran down Morton Street. It's very clear that that happened. What this is trying to do is take that very high wave energy and help it dissipate so the water doesn't even get up as high as the seawall to make it around the corner. It's a different strategy, and it will be a test case for the region, but we hope to be somewhat of the model for the region of there's a different way to look at this, that it becomes more cost effective when you're not replacing it every 30 years. And if this builds up correctly, this is the way the natural environment was before we cut it down to interact with it. So we're replanting things that would have been there naturally, essentially. So again, it's sustainable and hopefully it has a longer term future. In terms of funding sources, there's the MVP grant program, which Lee is going to hit on a little bit more, but we are lucky to have one as a regional entity with the MAPC to do resilient zoning. So we're going to be looking at all of the zoning that interacts with the ocean to make sure that these properties can be there longer term, and that when people are building new properties or they're redoing their houses, that they're taking this into account. I do not want to see houses wash away because they were not prepared for a storm that got to a certain storm surge height or an astronomical high tide. Whenever people are investing in their properties or commercial entities want to come downtown, this needs to be taken into account. People should not be spending money if they're not taking this into account, because honestly, your basement could get flooded in the longer term if you don't figure out where the water would go around your house. So everyone should be taking these things into account, but Leo will hit on that more. We're doing joint action with the Metropolitan Mayors Coalition, so that's Winthrop and 15 communities, including Boston and the Metro Boston area, that we're trying to take these things on a regional approach, because there's no borders with this type of stuff. Like the water's going to hit all of us. Again, we're the canary in the coal mine, but there's no avoiding it. So we need to work together on these things, and there is a willingness to work together amongst the managers and mayors from all around the area. There's the environmental bond bill money, so we are pulling on that for the Ingleside Park, and there's most likely at least another project in town that we can have funded by that source. Right now on the Hill, the governor has a climate resiliency bill. It's called S10 right now. It's in the Senate. It does have a funding source, and this goes to somewhat of a statewide, region-wide approach to tackling these issues. So in my vein of things that I like, it's doing a fair amount of those things. It does put a little bit of a burden on municipalities, but it's a good funding source. Speaker DeLeo also proposed a bill which passed through the House and now is with the Senate. It's called the Greenworks bill, and what this does is it provides $1 billion over 10 years to climate-related projects. It's a little trickier because it looks to add staffing at the municipal level. Municipalities have to kind of match some things in it. The funding sources are one of those to be determined things as well. But it already passed through the House, and both of those bills lie in the Senate. And from my position, I'll take either one. we need funding sources to pay for this stuff. So whatever way we get there is more money than we have available to us right now. So I don't really have a favorite in this game. I hope they both pass, in all honesty. Lastly, the federal government, which is somewhat difficult to deal with at times, but there are projects, FEMA-related projects and things like that. We still have outstanding money from one of the storms last year from FEMA to still bring into town to the tune of like $40-something thousand. But the federal government has the purse strings in a lot of these projects, and they're the ones who determine the path forward for some of these major climate initiatives. So we do at least have to try to work with them, and someday maybe there's going to be additional funding sources there that we can pull on, but we'll deal with that when the time comes. So just a couple additional items to hit on that fall outside of those 6. So realistically, we got that vulnerability assessment, and we are trying to attend to all of the items in the vulnerability assessment because, again, I want to leave Winthrop a better place than it was when I found it. Like that's my goal, and I want to set Winthrop on the path to being attentive to these types of things. I may not see all of these projects to get done, but I want to help people start thinking about them and understanding why they're important for the community to take on, because really this is the future of this type of work. So the state released a hazard mitigation and climate adaptation plan in late 2018. There's a new secretary of EEOA at the state who's very enthusiastic about climate change related items. So we do have support there and potential funding sources. There is the Mystic River Watershed Association, who I've been working with and trying to represent Winthrop's interest there, because the lower Mystic area and the outflow of the Mystic could very much impact Winthrop if there was something to happen per se at the Amelia Earhart Dam or something like that. So Julie may hit on some of that, but she'll talk about the region altogether. I'm on the MMA Energy and Environment Committee, so I kind of get out ahead of some of the legislation at the state level and lobbying on behalf of Winthrop and my professional association on this type of stuff. There is increased attention at the state with issues associated with climate change, as I said, through the new secretary with EEOA, and these bills starting to come up. People are starting to put money towards these items because, again, it is the better financial investment in the long term. We have a willingness to provide significant funding. There is a willingness at the state level to provide significant funding to municipalities, and they're giving it to municipalities, but they're also giving it to regional efforts, and they're giving priority to regional efforts from time to time. So we want to be in some of these things with Boston, with Revere, with Chelsea, so that it may be a bigger project, but we want to at least have a seat at the table and bring some of the work to Winthrop. And again, well, kind of hitting on this point, we're going to have to pursue regional approaches. We can, like I said, I could do it. I could try with our entire budget every year, and it's not enough. We have to rely on the state, federal government, the region, and work together on these things because Winthrop cannot spend its way out of this problem. We need to work together on these things. So lastly, a nice little picture of Winthrop to just remind us it can look nice out there when it's not a storm event. It can be beautiful, and we can enjoy the sunsets and sunrises. So thank you very much for your time, and I'm going to pass it over to Julie.
So first of all, I want to say how incredibly lucky you are to have Austin as your town manager, because, you know, there are, I think it's North Carolina where it's legislated that you can't talk about climate change. And it's sort of hard to negotiate with the ocean, right? You know, the ocean wins, so it's not a great strategy. So the fact that that you all are operationalizing the changes in weather is just you're ahead of the curve, and just huge applaud. So we are actually sitting at the very bottom of the Mystic River watershed that comes down from basically Route 128, sort of Reading, Woburn, and comes down past Cambridge, Somerville, Medford, and Winthrop and Revere are the tail end. And so the Mystic River goes out into Boston Harbor. And as Austin was saying, we are all in this together. We flood together. Our seawalls need to interact. If there's a big old storm, You don't want the jet fuel either in your neighborhood or in Boston Harbor, so we have a lot of work to do as a region. And the good thing is that there are a lot of smart people, a lot of folks willing to work together. My job tonight is really to give a bit of a Climate 101. So what are we talking about, and kind of when are we talking about it? And so before we get to Leah, this is a bit of the climate science and what we know at a big scale and how does it affect us here in Greater Boston. So we know that the Earth is getting warmer, but how do we know this? And this is a very short graphic that is the most densely packed piece of information that I've ever seen. So this is going to be a spiral, and it's basically the change in temperature from December of one year to December of the next year. So we're going to imagine what this spiral is going to look like. So if there's no change in temperature, what would the spiral do?
Circle.
Just as a circle, it doesn't get bigger or smaller. So if it gets colder, what does that spiral do?
It's never gone away from me.
It shrinks inwards, right. And so if it gets warmer, it goes outwards. So we're going to look at the global change month to month, December to December comparison from 1850 to 2017. See what that does. And you're going to notice a bit of an inflection point around 1970. All of a sudden, this is what record temperatures look like, right? We're not even overlapping anymore.
It's a cartoon part.
Yeah, exactly. It's a good cartoon. So that's at a global level. But what does that mean for our local weather? This was a storm in Framingham that wasn't even named because we don't name rainstorms. And maybe we should start naming rainstorms because that's actually where a lot of our damage is coming from. So we do have these big storms, and what had been super rare storms in the past are becoming more chronic. And lucky for us, we're not getting quite as many storms as the Gulf Coast, but they are giving a glimpse to us of what our stronger nor'easters and summer thunderstorms are looking like. And so we're learning from them and how do we need to adapt locally. So what Katrina showed us was you can't put all your eggs in one basket. Levees fail, seawalls fail, so you don't want to put your delicate, fragile stuff right behind the seawall and expect that one piece of infrastructure to protect you. You also have to have additional backup strategies. Make sure that your police fire station is up the hill, right? Not right where it could flood in case the seawall fails. The other thing is you have to know where the high ground is. So this is a place that had never flooded during Superstorm Sandy. All of the taxis went there. All of the taxis were destroyed, right? Because it had never flooded that much. This was a record. So all of our new record storms, they're teaching us new patterns. One of the things we learned in Snowmageddon, where we had 9 feet of snow in 6 weeks, is that bad weather doesn't affect everybody at the same time. So my husband and I, we both have salaries. We have one daughter who was out of school 10 times in 6 weeks. Pain for all of us. But we were not at risk of losing our jobs. Somebody who was a single parent working a minimum wage job, couldn't afford a taxi, couldn't afford childcare, might have lost their job and potentially their housing. So we're starting to learn how extreme weather really does exacerbate the haves and have-nots. And similarly, all that old-fashioned redlining, those are now the places that are seeing some of the worst climate change challenges. They're the places that typically have the fewest trees. They tend to be the lowest lying, and Houston was no different. In Hurricane Harvey, it was blacks and Latinos who actually fared disproportionately worse than white folks. And as Austin was saying, we need a new name for these 100-year storms because they don't come every 100 years anymore. In fact, in 2018, we had 2 100-year storms in 2 months. And this is the New England Produce Center in Chelsea and Everett. This is where all of our fruits and vegetables come through. This is a truck driving through the Atlantic Ocean. And so this is a place, it's a privately owned cooperative of 128 small businesses. They can't afford to protect themselves from climate. And it's not that we're going to not have fruits and vegetables, but if that goes away, thousands of jobs going to people who don't have college educations, those go away. And then it's more expensive for us to get fruits and vegetables as well. The other thing that we're learning with these new crazy storms, so this is from Hurricane Florence in North Carolina. That black is hog waste. And so what new, it's gross. It's going right into the rivers, it's going into the ocean, it's also going into people's houses. So when they are cleaning up from this flooding, they're covered with toxics, right? Diseases, poop. And so for the lower Mystic, also known as Boston Harbor, we have old industrial sites. They're fine now. As we get bigger floods, those capped brownfields can get uncapped. And, or those oil tanks could overflow. If they overflow with salt water, there's no room for the oil to go if the oil tank springs a leak. And the problem with those big oil tanks is when they are not full, they can float and twist, and that's when you have an oil spill, when the pipes break. So we are actually working together on infrastructure resilience, making sure we can storm harden all that big infrastructure near us to protect people and to protect business continuity. And then there's one house. So the building code was for less than this house. This house was like 4 years old. This was in the Florida Panhandle in Hurricane Matthew. So the building code said prepare for winds of 175 miles an hour. And these folks were like, well, it's getting windier. We're going to do it for 225 miles an hour. They were the only house standing. And, it didn't actually cost them that much more to do it. They just did things like had no eaves and, worked harder on that. And so what the government regulates to matters a great deal. And also how well you build it, even with the building code. And then this is poor Bermuda during Dorian. And that outline is what Bermuda is supposed to be like. And that's actually under ocean, right? And so for our lower lying neighbors, it's not just what happens in Winthrop and elsewhere. We're going to need to welcome some refugees, because some of these lower lying parts of the world are not going to be habitable forever. It's not going to take that many hurricanes before people give up on places like Bermuda.
Bermuda?
Bahamas.
Yeah, okay.
Not Bermuda. The Bahamas, sorry. It says right there. Sorry.
That's how we know.
My brain works. Bahamas. We know. No, not Bermuda. But how striking that, you can see the outline of what's normally dry land. The highest point on one of the islands in the Bahamas, the first one to get hit, and I'm now forgetting its name, is 30 feet above high tide, and they had 23-foot storm surges. So, but the thing is about climate change, you don't get a storm every day. You don't get a storm every year. There's a lot of chronic things, and that's more what we're going to be having to deal with in our budgets, in our own lives. And let's look at that a little bit. So we're going to see hotter summers. Like, we're apparently already seeing what historically Connecticut saw for summers. So when I was grew up on the North Shore, we would see about, here it is right here, this is Climate Ready Boston projections. We'd see about 11 days above 90 degrees. Summers felt like they were sort of 75 degrees, right? There were a few hot nights, but not that big of a deal. 10 years from now, we could see between 20 and 40 days, so half the summer being above 90 degrees. And one of the things that's happening is the nights are warmer too, which is really tough on folks. It's hard to sleep, especially with folks with illnesses. They're sort of tossing and turning, and that brings health down as well. And then by the end of the century, we might see all summer being above 90 degrees. So we're looking at 2030, 2050 having the climate of Baltimore, 2070 having the climate of Alabama, and poor Alabama, right? So this is something we haven't had to deal with before. A lot of us, I'm sure, did not grow up with air conditioning. A lot of our older houses can't stand air conditioning, don't have the electrical outlets for it. We're also seeing increasing ocean temperatures. I actually want to start this again. So let's look at how the ocean is going. It's a little funky right now. But right below Greenland, you're going to see it go hot, 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 and then cold. What's that?
The ice.
The ice melting, right? So our temperatures, see, he's good at this.
I like answering questions. Sorry. The student in me, I'm always looking to answer questions. Sorry.
Thank you.
It's
I
scary.
get it.
Never go away.
Aw,
Old habits
but
die
you're-
hard.
That's good. But, so what happens when you heat up ocean water is you get stronger storms. And so, here's you guys. You're my model for coastal flooding. So we are getting more coastal flooding as a result of these warmer oceans, both because when ocean water is hotter, when any water is hotter, it expands, but also land-based ice, like in Greenland and Antarctica, also melts and adds to the ocean. And there's some local reasons why we're getting a little bit faster coastal flooding in the Northeast. So this is also from Climate Ready Boston a few years ago. They are doing an update, but this is pretty close. So what this says is that if we do everything possible, there's some sea level rise locked in. So that's that lighter blue. It basically says we have already put enough carbon into the atmosphere that if we automatically went from cars to bikes, elevators to stairs, carbon-based fuels to not, we would still see about 2.5 feet of sea level rise around Boston by the end of the century. If we have business as usual, as we are right now, we're on track to having 7.5 feet of sea level rise, even possibly up to over 10 feet of sea level rise by the end of the century. And why that matters is Copley Square is flooded at high tide at 7.5 feet above sea level rise. So much of Greater Boston, our marshes were filled in to make more land. Those marshes remember, right? And they will flood as the ocean gets higher. So this is what we're looking at. This is a probability map. This is not all flooding, but this is basically the darker the color, the darker the purple, the more likely it is to flood in the year 2070. So this is, and then a different year. Like as time goes on, it'll be more and more and more probable. But this is a snapshot. So the astonishing thing to me, so if you're looking at dark blue, that's now tidal flooding, right? So there's a bunch of Winthrop that it is projected to flood twice a day to once every 2 years by the end of the century, if you do nothing, right? Basically, if you do no seawalls, if you do no other things. So yes, this is pretty critical. One of the things that was striking, we also work with Malden. Malden becomes coastal. If you look at how we start to flood through Revere, Malden has a backdoor flood route, which I bet it's not focused on right now. So, and then I live in near Alewife, and I get my drinking water from Fresh Pond, which is over here. And by 2070, every 5 years, my drinking water supply gets hit by salt water, right? So what this says to me is not that we're going to allow this to happen. It's that we have another big dig level of investment ahead of us. Because this is the economic heart of New England. We're not going to actually let Boston flood tidally, right? So heads up. So that's coastal flooding. We also have to think about our rain getting bunchier. So we have flash floods, flash droughts. So this is what's called a cloudburst or a cloud bomb over Phoenix. We are getting more of our rain in more intense rainstorms, either winter nor'easters, snow or rain, summer thunderstorms, and then we get flash droughts in between, if you remember.
We had a microburst last month, actually.
Right? And so
Yep.
that's from more energy in the environment. Yeah, and so who who thinks of coastal Massachusetts as getting tornadoes, but we're starting to get those really intense high energy storms. And so it's harder on our plants, it's harder on our people, it's harder on our infrastructure that's used to less flooding. This, maybe I'll actually turn on my, somehow it is not giving you the sound to this, because it's a very loud, anyway, this is a rainstorm in Ontario. And it's a very loud rainstorm when I have volume. But this looks tropical. It's in Canada. We get these. We didn't get these when we were little, right? And so this overpowers our older stormwater systems that are really based on a 1 every 2 years intensity storm, whatever, a 10-year intensity storm. These are more like our old probabilities were like 1 in 1,000 year storm, 1 in 500 year storm. That doesn't mean that we're going to only see 1 in 500 years from now. It means that our probabilities are off. We need to sort of recalibrate what to expect. And then in between, we get these intense flash droughts. So if you remember 2016, we had 4 inches of rain in 4 months. We typically have an inch of rain a week. And it was hard on our reservoirs, it was hard on our plants, hard on our farmers. So I want to show you this idea of needing to make room for the river. And this is more upstream than coastal. But this is what the Malden and Mystic rivers look like today. This is just taken from Google. And I'm going to overlay it with what that river looked like the year my mom was born in 1938.
Wow.
Right, and look at how much room we gave the river. Because we didn't have a dam, this was a tidal river and people let it flood without harm. One of our strategies, just like that cool strategy that you all did, what park is that? Coughlin Park, is to say, actually nature knows how to flood without harm. We're not going to prevent flooding. We can prevent flood damage. That's our strategy. Mm-hmm. And so again, we need to make more room for the river. My husband was saying, head for the hills. I'm like, no, that's not the right branding. Make room for the river. That's better. Similarly, this is the broader Mystic River, Chelsea Creek, up to the Mystic Lakes up in Arlington. This is, again, today I'm going to show you what it looked like in 1900 before we started filling land. Those are all tidal rivers. Those are saltwater rivers. Even where Alewife is today was a saltwater marsh. And I'm going to show you what it's going to look like in 2070. The river remembers, like these places remember flooding, and that's where we will see flooding. So if you are worried about whether your house floods, look at a 1900s map. Give you a sense of what to accept. On the other hand, we also have these projections, which are probably more accurate. The last thing I want to give you a sense of what to expect is, remember how we're getting all these funny cold springs? Like, wait, why is it so cold in April, May? For one is, actually this is how springs used to be. We're sort of forgetting that they used to be colder before. So this spring that felt cold, that was an old normal spring. But we also are getting these really late snowstorms, and there's a reason for that. Remember the polar vortex, what they're talking about? What the polar vortex is it's the jet stream that goes around the Arctic. We have a jet stream that we think of that pushes our weather from west to east. But the polar vortex, when the air is cold, and the air is super, super cold when the Arctic ice is fully iced out, that keeps the air spinning quickly and tightly, and all that cold air stays where it's supposed to be. As the Arctic ice is melting, that water's just a little less cold than the ice. And that relatively warm, though we wouldn't consider it warm, air goes up and it slows down and wobbles that polar vortex. And so instead of spinning up at the Arctic where we want it to be, it slops down into New England, is one of the places it slops down. And we get these blasts of polar air. And so I have this pizza dough model of climatology, because the actual climatology is quite complex. But it's suffice it to say, it should be like this guy spinning pizza, quick and round, and what it's doing instead is how I would be spinning pizza dough, which is quite slow and floppy. And so it's that floppy air that is nailing us every spring. So now you know. So thank you very much, and I hope that was helpful. Yeah.
Hi, everybody. My name is Leah Robbins. I'm with MAPC, the Metropolitan Area Planning Council. It is such a pleasure to get to be with you guys tonight and to get to be on this panel. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the Metro Mayor's Climate Task Force that Austin mentioned. Climate doesn't really respect town boundaries, and Winthrop is really at the forefront of coming together with neighboring communities to figure out how are we going to address this together. I'm going to talk a little bit about what are some of these resources that Winthrop is already using, and then some other resources to consider that are kind of up and coming that we're seeing at the regional planning agency level. Okay, so who is MAPC? We are a planning agency. We represent 101 cities and towns, 3.2 million residents, 1.8 million jobs. It's a big area. It's a quasi-state agency. There are other regional planning agencies in the state, so we serve, each city and town is served by a regional planning agency, and we get to work with cities and towns to sort of provide additional assistance beyond what any municipality could hire for. So climate change is really what we've been created for in some ways. Traditionally, regional planning agencies deal with housing and transportation, but climate is really up our bandwagon. The Metro Mayors Coalition is 15 of those municipalities that make up 1.2 million residents. And we also are engaging, in addition to the municipalities, with state and federal agencies. And we come together on a regular basis to say, what are some of those best practices? What are people doing? The mayors and managers meet together not just on climate, but on housing, on transportation, on a number of different issues, and really engaging with stakeholders. And one of the things that the mayors and managers are tackling most in-depthly is climate preparedness. So back in 2015, the mayors and managers convened to sign a commitment, which formed a group of staff that meet regularly just to talk about climate and really dig in on this one topic of mitigation, adaptation, and resiliency. How are we preparing our communities? And then in November of 2016, they convened again and said, we're really going to mitigate climate, and we're going to try to bring our greenhouse gases down. So this is maybe a little more in the weeds, but they tackle three strategic priorities, right? Local alignment and capacity building. How are we going to be building our ability to address climate change as a group? How are we mitigating heat impacts, like Julie was talking about, these incredibly hot summer days that are really going to be impacting residents, because many of our buildings don't have air conditioning and aren't built to cool in that way, and flooding impacts, which Austin really highlighted that you guys are facing here in Winthrop. And how are we going to deepen our coordination between public and private entities and different government levels to make sure that we're coordinating together and that the right hand knows what the left hand is doing and that we're maximizing our impact. So our commitment to mitigation is really deep. We committed as a region of 15 mayors and managers. This is, I think, a historic commitment. I don't believe that other regions had yet done this when we committed in 2015 to saying we are going to be a net zero region by 2050. So that we make sure we're not having those 7.5-foot waves. We're going to make a real commitment to address that now and really working together to help make that a reality. The coalition is also working to address our vulnerabilities in those shared critical infrastructure. So the Amelia Earhart Dam that Julie mentioned and the New England Produce Center. You can see here really poorly in my tiny image where the flooding is looking like it could happen and some of the different proposals for how to mitigate those impacts and make sure that though driving through the ocean is not something that we see happening on a regular basis, because we need both the economic impacts are huge for jobs and for our ability to access produce, but it's really critical infrastructure. So that's some of the Metro Mayor's coalition work, and I think I really give credit to Austin for bringing the concerns of Winthrop residents to that table to make sure that we as a coalition are advocating with our full voice for resiliency on the waterfront and all of the different local, state, and federal resources to make sure that we're getting the full amount of funding that is needed, or at least as much as we can, because there is a lot that we can do to make our region stronger. So I'm going to talk about some of the climate resources that are currently in use here in Winthrop. One is the Municipal Vulnerability Preparedness Program, the MVP program. So Winthrop had a series of workshops that really tried to address what are those vulnerabilities here in town. And the assessment that came out of that is what Austin was talking about, sort of those 6 areas. And it's a new state program, really exciting to see communities come together across disciplines and say, how are we all going to incorporate climate into our planning? One of the other things that the community has taken on is the Soul Smart program. This is a program through the Federal Department of Energy that seeks to address those solar soft costs. So what are those ways that we can make solar energy easier for people to access? So bringing down those costs for permitting and siting and all of those sorts of things, sort of the community saying up front, here's how we're going to make it easier for solar energy to come in. So we're going to increase our ability to provide clean energy to residents, make it easier for us to go off the grid if the power system goes down, and easier for us to reduce our greenhouse gases and make sure we have those lower wave outcomes. So Winthrop joined with Boston, Cambridge, Somerville, Melrose, Chelsea, and Natick. So really coming together, not saying one little town is going to do it and take on the burden, that administrative burden of figuring out all the best practices, but really coming together and pooling resources. So we have an online permitting checklist, increased transparency, and there was the Solarize campaign in town. So really incredible stuff. Winthrop is one of only a handful of communities in Massachusetts that has taken that on and is really leading the way in solar energy here in the Commonwealth. Some emerging climate resources. As Austin mentioned, this Climate Smart Cities initiative is an incredible program. I'm going to flip to my notes really quickly because I don't want to say anything off topic. But MAPC hosted the Urban Green Infrastructure Lab to do a presentation to the task force to talk through some of the latest research for ways that we can be more resilient to climate change in terms of cooling, absorbing, and protecting our assets. There's a lot of green infrastructure happening locally that we can learn from each other. And I think Winthrop's example of the coastline is huge. Arlington is doing some cool stuff with Alewife Brook Parkway. Chelsea Housing Authority is doing some really interesting projects because, as we talked about earlier, climate change is going to impact us all at different times in different ways, and our most vulnerable residents need to really be looked after by our communities. So one of the other really cool things that the Climate Smart Cities Initiative is doing is helping us think through our planning and looking really deeply, really be able to look at layers on our map so that when we're doing planning processes, we can zoom in and see what do we think might be happening and really support decisions locally with data. And it's an online portal that planners can access, but also the whole public can access. So I'll make sure to circulate that link if folks want to take a peek. This is looking at heat data and land surface temperature. So it doesn't really take into account the breezes you might feel, but really what is the temperature on the land? And this is a partnership with the Trust for Public Land. That's the other thing I really want to emphasize. You take away one thing, take away that Winthrop is not alone, that Winthrop is working at the leadership level with a number of different organizations, with the Regional Planning Agency, with nonprofits that are leading the way, and with many other entities that are addressing this issue together. It's an all hands on deck moment, and Winthrop is at the forefront. Another incredible tool is the Property Assessed Clean Energy Program. This is a new program in the Commonwealth. Literally, like, the final rules have not yet been written. It's a tool to finance clean energy improvements on commercial and industrial properties. So to finance these, the property owner agrees to a betterment on the property, which will then like repay the financing. And it allows owners to undertake more comprehensive energy assessments. If you've ever looked at replacing your roof to put solar on and seen all the zeros that come after it, this is a way to allow commercial properties to access funding, to do those initiatives, to make the building more resilient, more, it's a pretty cool program. They're still developing the guidelines and figuring out the financing. It's expected to be available later in 2020. A community has to opt into it and vote to participate in the program. And it's an incredible, I think, job creation possibility and environmental benefits as well. So really all about how do we address climate change, but also how do we help our communities in general? What are the ways we want to develop jobs? How do we want to have our community grow? So that's one of the things I think PACE could do. Another is the resilient zoning work. Winthrop won a very competitive grant program. So after a community does the municipal vulnerability assessment process, you can take a look at your assessments and what the community has identified as needing addressing, and you can propose an action grant. And there were many action grants applied for in this past year, and Winthrop was successful in applying for resilient zoning. So this project is going to allow the community to look at the different land use policies and figure out what are the ways that Winthrop can protect our natural systems and strengthen our infrastructure. What are those rules that we can put in place to help make sure that new buildings are going to be protected and that we're able to grow in a way that is also keep maintaining our safety. It's a really incredible opportunity and is really going to lead the way for the region and really develop those best practices that the other communities can benefit from and really help. So that is what I have, very brief, after these incredible presentations, and I'm so excited to be here and hear what's on everyone's mind and what you're thinking about in terms of climate preparedness as we're here in Climate Week in Massachusetts, and ready to roll up sleeves and get working.
So now we've done these presentations. We can open it up to a few questions if the community has some. But again, thank you for coming out. This is a very important topic for us to frequently be considering in town. This should be part of the conversation when the budget comes around, when I'm introducing it in the spring, but it's something that needs to be in the back of everyone's minds as we go forward. So, sure.
There's a lot of information that's so depressing and really depressing, and on a national level, being aware of it. But I think for those of us sitting here, we've got to be awfully grateful that we have the leadership that we have, where the insight of seeing, not to build concrete walls, but to do green infrastructure that will last well beyond any of our lifetimes. And it's a wonderful thing it's a bit of hope, I would say, because if you've been watching the news and hearing some voices trying to be, crying in the wilderness, this seems very hopeful that we have this kind of leadership here. So I think I'd speak not just for myself, but so many of us that we're appreciative.
Yay! Take it in now.
Yeah, I appreciate that. This is different than some of the other public meetings. Yeah, I appreciate that. And, I kind of can put this pretty simply. I have a daughter that will be 4 in December and a son that will be 2 in February. I want them to actually be able to drive to Winthrop in the future and Winthrop to not be an actual island. So that's what I'm working on. And ultimately, I just want to leave this place a better place than when I came here. So whatever we can do to kind of put some of these things in place and get people to at least start thinking about it, it is gonna, every step is a step in progress in this type of stuff. So thank you. Sure.
Tracy, I'm wondering if we'll be working with the two giant entities that flank us, MWRA and Massport. Will we receive any help from them, or are we part of their disaster recovery?
Absolutely. So MWRA, that is actually the facility it's not technically in town, it's right on the edge of town, but that area is prepared for a storm. So very high levels of berms that they have and things like that. So they are prepared for the storm. So they are more than willing to help us in our disaster recovery, and they're going to help us with some of our infrastructure projects. And much of the borrowing that we're doing for the Center Business District infrastructure project is based off of MWRA offered loans that come at 0% or very low interest loans. So we are utilizing the resources that MWRA does make available right now. That is not to say that we're not going to continue to negotiate and mitigate with them as much as possible. In terms of the airport, we know we have a new opportunity with the airport with a new CEO. So the CEO is cognizant of many of the issues in town. So all of the sound and things like that we have to deal with the FAA with, we are working in conjunction with her to alleviate some of those concerns. In terms of investing in climate change, we have our pilot agreement. We also have the Winthrop Foundation, but there is an additional conversation that can be had about the impacts of climate change. So we are having it from my office and with the MMC, we're having almost like two parallel conversations. In terms of Winthrop, I'm concerned with one, getting people in and out of Winthrop safely when the airport is operating. The airport is only going to continue getting bigger, unfortunately. It is a major international airport, and it is one of the economic engines of this entire area. It's not going to stop growing. They are looking to alleviate the transportation concerns. So on one hand, they're going to get cars to stop idling at the airport and going around the airport. It's going to it can essentially be a tram system if you've seen in Tampa or Denver, other airports around the country where there's a centrally located parking area and everyone, including Uber drivers or people dropping their cars, all get dropped off at one location and they take a tram around. So you have the carbon reduction right there. That doesn't necessarily help a place like Winthrop, though, because we still have to get by that. And we have essentially 6,000 cars that leave Winthrop every day and have to go through the tunnel by that entity. So we are trying to bring them to the table to say, you need to invest in this with the state. It can't just be Winthrop and Boston talking with Massport. It needs to be the entire region talking with Massport because we are all impacted by it. When you have so many Lyfts and Ubers and people driving there, I drive here from Holliston every day. And in all honesty, round trip between gas and tolls, it's about $18 per day. I would gladly pay more if I could get in easier, or I could take a train that was quicker, or there was just other options available to me. So I think that we want to bring Massport to the table to say, can you help out and pay some of your own fair share with it? And we'll see where that goes. But we are looking at every entity because solving part of the transportation problem will help some of the climate issues. But they know that, again, we are the feeder island here. Like if Winthrop fails, there will be impacts on MWRA and Massport. There's only so much water we can take on, and then it starts messing up the entire harbor. So they are here talking to us about it, and even if they aren't going to give us money for it, they're willing to talk to us about engineering work that they could help us with, or different firms that we could work with on their behalf so we can get kind of advanced feasibility studies done and things like that. So they are at the table to work with us, and they truly understand the impacts of these because for a place like Massport, that's their longer term financial modeling is based off of the impacts of climate change. They need to, if they continue to grow and their runways are going underwater, they can't, it doesn't work unless they invent a new kind of plane. So not to my knowledge.
So they're 6 feet above high tide, and the highest we've had is 5 feet. So the issue, when I first started doing this, I used to think, oh my God, the airport's 6 feet above high tide. And a friend who had been thinking about this longer said, so what? Pavement floods. You care if the jet fuel floods, you care if the terminals flood. So part of feeling less bad about this is to say, okay, so what? what do we care about? What's okay? Beaches flood twice a day. They're okay. How can it be okay to be more flood prone, to be more drought prone, to be more heat prone? It's a bummer, but there are parts of the world who've been dealing this for generations. So we may be getting closer to like monsoon cultures, but people can thrive in monsoon cultures. How can we thrive with sort of this rainfall that gets really intense and then more intense droughts? We're not used to it, but other people can teach us. So I think some of it is not panicking and saying, and also, how can we make these investments more beautiful? Because this is going to be more expensive, how can we make a seawall that's also a park, that's also more natural habitat, that also does something else, so that we're solving multiple problems at the same time?
Thanks, Julie. Julie in the back. Sorry, go ahead.
Quickly, Julia Willers. Another one of the heavy-hitting entities we have here besides MWRA and Massport is HYM, Suffolk Downs development right across from the marsh, right? I live on Morton Street, and I don't know the details, so forgive me if I'm ignorant to them, but I've heard that there have been some mitigation strategies that they're exploring that were going to help them that might have an adverse effect on us because we're on the other side of the marsh, sort of pushing the water to us, preventing them. Is that true, or are there conversations that we're a part of to prevent that from happening?
So you go ahead.
So it's not true. How's that? So they actually realized.
A lot of alternative facts
Yeah.
out there. So.
Yeah. So Sales Creek, which actually right now is sort of part of the infield of the old track, actually is considered part of the Rumney Marsh complex, and it's protected. And so what's actually driving factor for them, unfortunately, is not your house, but the creek. And in order to not affect this creek, they are totally re-landscaping, so their stormwater goes into Chelsea Creek away from you. And then when you're thinking about coastal flooding, what happens on one property doesn't actually affect you one way or the other. It's about the ocean height. So the opportunity for Suffolk Downs is to have them, as part of their mitigation, actually pay for a study that says, how do you protect the whole neighborhood?
Yeah.
How do you do the coastal barrier for the whole neighborhood, such that all the way around to East Boston?
Both sides, all sides of the marsh.
Yep. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, because you can right now there's essentially a natural berm there that we need them to explore the other side of that berm. So
Yeah, unfortunately, what's in the way is the blue line. You know,
Yeah.
like if the blue line went there, you could do a lot of cool things. But so putting that out there. So anyway, but so I think one good thing that is likely to come out of this is that one of the community benefits would be to pay for the plan to say, how do we protect our neighborhoods at a regional level?
thank you, Julie. All right, let's do 2 more questions. You've had your hand up.
She
Sure.
kind of asked my question, because I live right across from Suffolk Downs.
Okay.
Area there. But what about the oil farm over there? That's.
Chelsea.
That's yeah.
So I actually had a surprisingly good. Sorry, I don't know you well enough to do that, but you're right. I mean, that is my biggest worry. So working for a watershed association and also just living here, my biggest worry is it's not just the oil farm right next to Suffolk Downs. There's 100+ oil tanks in the lower Mystic, and none of those are regulated to the more intense storms that we're dealing with. And what we have seen in the Bahamas, not Bermuda, and in Houston and in North Carolina, these big storms, again, is these tanks aren't really designed for these bigger storms. They twist and break, they crumple. That's my biggest worry. It's wind and waves. The tanks right now next to Suffolk Downs, they are elevated. It's much more about like a big honking, like a microburst hitting one of those, not just general flooding, because they are all elevated. They don't want to have to clean up an oil spill either. But it's them, and it's another, almost 100 tanks all in the region. The good news is that the infrastructure managers, including MWRA, including Massport, including a bunch of the oil terminals, they are willing to work together on a regional vulnerability assessment and come up with basically, if the electricity shuts, if the grid goes down, the T stops, you can't recharge your phone, the gas pumps don't work. So we're actually pulling together the funding to work to do a cascading effects vulnerability assessment. What happens if part of our infrastructure doesn't work? What happens to the rest of it? And so how do you keep that going, not just the oil tanks, but the rest of it? And what's our plan B if we fail? And that is really important work that these guys, including the oil terminals, actually want to do. Nobody wants to be that person who's made that mistake, right?
I think briefly too, I think the state is doing a ton. I really think Massachusetts, under Governor Baker and under Secretary Theo Harity's leadership, is doing a lot of work and thinking through what are our what are our vulnerabilities as a state? Where do we need to be looking? Where are each of our agencies needing to invest their resources? And how do we come up with a coordinated plan so that it's not each company, each city, each town coming up with a plan for dealing with the oil tanks, but like all of the oil tanks in the state. Let's look at all of this and figure out some best practices, and let's look across the watershed and see maybe there's some best practices in different parts of the state that we need to adopt, and look at our dams differently across the whole state and all of our culverts and all of these places that are going to be impacted. But I think there's a real interest in working across the state and coming up with these plans and learning from best practices across the Northeast and across the U.S., but really Massachusetts is leading, which is sometimes scary when we look at the data and we're like, oh God, we have a lot to do, we're leading. But there really is a lot of good efforts of addressing these together and coming up with, looking at what these vulnerabilities are, making those assessments, and then implementing the plans and finding the resources to implement the plans and make them a reality. Which I think is hopefully some comfort.
And it's not waiting for regulations.
Right.
Like what you guys are doing here, you're not waiting for regulations to try new things. It's really taking the leadership and leaning in and saying,
Yeah.
Our weather's getting worse. It's doing so in unpredictable ways.
Right.
Let's be our best selves and figure this out.
Yeah, the resilient zoning work is really exciting that you guys are doing, and I hope you'll stay engaged, and it's kicking off this fall. And there's going to be more coming, so please stay engaged and figure out what the roles can be here in Winthrop to help grow.
Let's do one last question. I got a ballerina at home that's going to be mad at me. So, right in the middle.
I apologize if I missed the very beginning, so if you addressed this, but as a town with only 2 ways in or out, are we looking at mitigating the loss of Revere Street at Short Beach every time there's a nor'easter?
Those are based into our emergency management plans. Those are taken into account. Those flood, so on the Revere side, we don't actually control that gate. So that's something that is up to outside entities, just like the what is the pond next to the golf course? We don't control those tidal gates as well. Lewis Lake. So we don't control the tidal gates at Lewis Lake either. That's controlled by CZM. So some of these things are out of our hands, and we have to communicate with higher levels of government. So inside of the water tower, there is Homeland Security equipment, MEMA and FEMA equipment. We are able to get in touch with them in real time. And MWRA, MEMA, those are the people that got us out of that storm last year. It was, unfortunately, I'm making a big investment in our DPW vehicles, but our DPW vehicles were failing at that time. They didn't function in that, and some of them were even out of inspection, so we couldn't even operate them. So we had to rely on the outside sources on those things, but that all of these events are taken into what public safety plans on, and how they interact with other entities, because that one of those types of things happen, we're in touch, we're going to the airport, we're going to the state, we're going to the MWRA saying, how do we ensure that people in town are safe? Because that is ultimately the most important thing. We don't want anyone to be extraordinarily negatively impacted by a storm.